the process of getting artwork into an embroiderable state, the digitizing process, where we are applying stitches to artwork, that's something that, well, a lot of the digitizers I talk to we all kind of follow a very similar process. So I wanted to kind of walk through that process with you. So at least you know how one digitizer and honestly a lot of my buddies, how they do it. And the first thing that we do is we get the graphic on screen. And that sounds kind of silly, but and occasionally, yeah, I will just start digitizing shapes and put them together in DesignShop. And I don't really have artwork that I'm following. I'm just putting things together. And yes, I have done that, but oftentimes the first thing that I do is I get the graphic on screen. And that can either be raster artwork or vector artwork. And the process, the rest of the process is largely the same for both of those. Whether it's raster or vector, most of it's all the same. The difference may be how you apply the stitches or if you're creating the shapes or not, but the rest of it's all the same. The layering, the pathing, all of that. So I get the artwork on screen and then I scale it. And that's really important. I want my artwork to be the size that it is for the final product. Whatever it's going to be on whatever garment or whatever I'm putting it on, I want my artwork to be that size. And the reason that I want that and the reason that's so important to me is a lot of the decisions that I make, stitch type, layering, do I have a hole here or do I just fill it in with stitches? A lot of that is based on the size of the elements, the size of the negative spaces, and the relationships between those. So if my artwork isn't at that final size, I'm maybe not making the best decisions because those decisions are so very much based on the size of those elements. Okay, so once I get it scaled, it's the size I want it to be, the next thing I do is I start to plan it out, and I kind of plan it out for layers and push and that kind of thing. And for me, I think about embroidery as a low relief sculpture. And it really kind of is. You've got dimension, you've got foreground, you've got background, you've got that play of light. So if you treat it as that, you can get a lot of dimensionality out of your embroidery. So a large part of what I plan is honestly background to foreground. So whatever's in the background, I tend to sew earlier on. Whatever's in the foreground, I tend to sew later. Are there exceptions? Yeah, absolutely. But that's a large part of how I plan. The other thing that I think about is my thread colors. I tend to sew a little bit, lighter colors first, then darker colors, because darker colors are harder to cover up with lighter thread on a light garment. Now, if it's on a dark garment, it's a little bit different. That's a minor bit of my planning. That one I don't take into consideration that much. I can kind of cover it up a little bit more with underlay, and so that one's just a minor player in my thought process. The other big thing I think about is, and this I may think about more than even background to foreground, is I think about how is the material going to push? What is the embroidery going to do to my surface? Am I sewing towards an anchor? Am I sewing towards something that isn't going to move? So if it was a cap, am I sewing towards the bill? Probably not my best bet. Am I sewing towards the center seam? Also, probably not my best bet. Am I sewing towards something that I have already sewn? That could create a pinch point where there's a ripple. I'd rather sew away from it. So that's a lot of what I plan is sewing away from things that I've sewn before, sewing away from things that aren't going to move. Okay, after I get that kind of general plan, and I might write it down, I might just have it kind of in my head. But after I do that, then I really start to think about stitch types. What are these pieces of my embroidery design going to be? What's going to be a fill? What's going to be a satin stitch? What's going to be a walk stitch? What's going to have that little bit of detail? How am I going to get here? How am I going to get there? And what is that going to do to the light? So fill stitches, they tend to be a little bit flatter. They tend to fall back in space a little bit. Satin stitches have a little bit more sheen. They tend to come forward a little bit. So I think about that when I'm looking at those shapes. They also have different size ranges, right? So that's, again, where that scaling it really matters. If I'm doing a huge jacket back, my chances of doing satin stitched letters may go down. I may have to do a fill so that it stays in the garment. But if I'm doing it for a left chest, well, then I can probably do that satin stitch and get that rounded effect and get that play of light. And so a lot of that stitch type depends on that size, but it also kind of depends foreground to background. Things to think about. Is it absolutely, these are hard and fast rules? No. Play with it. And sometimes I will digitize something and be like, yeah, I don't really like it that way. And I'll delete it and do it a different way. Okay. After I get that plan, and that plan I do kind of write out a little bit so that I don't forget. After that plan, then I start to kind of set up my properties. Now, lately, this has been far less of my process. And that's largely because the properties in DESIGNSHOP are far, far closer to what I just use anyway. So the default properties, I like them most of the time. And so the kind of pre-setup of properties that I do, unless my design's really going on something different, I tend to leave them and then I just make some final tweaks at the end. Yeah, I'd like that a little bit lighter. Yeah, I'd like that a little bit different. I make that at the end. Okay, once I get that set up, and again, largely the default properties are kind of set up for me, then comes the input of the shapes. That's when I trace around everything. If it's a raster, if it's a vector, I may trace around it. I may choose to do that, or I may choose to use the shapes that are there and just apply stitches to them. So that's kind of the big chunk of time is doing that bit, inputting all the shapes, getting it in the order that you want. Okay, going through that. And then after I'm done with that, I do kind of a finish up. And this is what will get me if I'm really not paying attention. Go in, make sure that I've got tie stitches. Okay, they're on by default. I'm pretty good, but if I'm using a computer that I haven't used in a while, or my properties are, I don't know, I applied a weird style, or I didn't have coffee that morning, just go double check, make sure you have tie stitches. Usually I will center the design to the origin. So not always, but usually I will do that. Once I get that done, then I will sew it out. So I will send it over to the machine, I will sew it out, and I will sew it on a fabric that is as close to the finished product as I can. So I may not have an extra duck beefy coat lying around. Okay, so maybe I layer up some batting and some felt and then a big piece of cotton ducked over it to kind of mimic what that coat would do. I will get something about as thick, about the same texture, about the same material, because that's going to play a large part in my edits. So once I sew that out, then I edit. And it may take me a sew out or two, or three or four, depending on the material and the complexity of the design. And that's okay. Once I get it all the way that I want it and I've edited it down, then I'm ready to go into my production. So that's really the process. Let's take a look at what it looks like kind of on screen. Let's go ahead and open that file, and I'm in the designs folder that's loaded with your software. So local disk C, designs, graphics, and I'm going to grab Earth Day. And this is a design that we've used in a lot of different trainings, and we use it for a few different reasons. So I'm going to keep using it. I'm going to open that up. Now, this is a raster file, and that's completely fine. One thing we should look at, though, is if you want to narrow down what you're seeing, you can choose a specific file type to look at, or you could choose all graphics if you just want to see graphics files, or all embroidery files if you were opening an embroidery file. It's set to all embroidery and graphics files. This is stuff that's openable by DESIGNSHOP, so I'm just going to leave it at that, but that's something you can use to kind of narrow down what you're looking at if you're looking in a huge, huge file folder. The other thing that you can do, if you know the name of it, you can start typing in and get to it. Now I've already opened that, so I'm going to hit cancel. But before I do, we're going to look at one other thing. It is Open Raster Graphics at Stored Resolution. So some graphics files can store their resolution settings in it. So it may be, you may have two files that have the same pixel dimensions, but they'll open differently in DesignShop because one of them was saved at 300 dpi and it was 3 inches wide, whereas the other was saved at 100 dpi and it didn't save the settings. So it's going to open up way, way bigger because it has far fewer pixels per inch. So leaving that checked, if it comes in a little bit differently, doesn't really matter. The big thing that matters is when we scale it down here. So I'm going to scale this. I'm going to bring this down. I'm going to scale it to 3.5 inches. And then I'm just going to hit enter. And that's going to scale my graphic. Now I selected the graphic file in the project tab before I did that. So I've done garments, and often they were infant garments that, wow, you could really only get one size hoop into. If that's the case, you better make sure your design fits within that hoop. So instead of doing things by numbers, I'd get the hoop up on screen and I would scale it graphically to fit in that hoop. So if that was the case, I would right click on my hoop manager and I would select the hoop that I could get into that garment, hit apply and OK. And then if I left click on display currently selected hoop, so I right click to get to the properties of it, I left click to display it, well, we're definitely over that dotted line, which is not going to work for us. So if I select the graphic here, I still have those resize edit handles just like I do with any embroidery design. So if I hold shift and alt, I can scale it down. Now I'm inside that dotted line. Now if I add a little bit of pull offset, I may still hit it. So I'm going to go down just a touch more. And I think that would work for this hoop. Now it's a little tight, but I think we're good to go with that one. So that's something else that you may tend to do, is see what hoop fits in your garment and then make sure your design fits within that hoop. One other kind of interesting trick you can do for scaling a design is use your ruler. So yeah, your ruler, if you left click and drag, can show you how big something is. But if you right click and drag, it will show you how big it is, but then it'll ask you how big you want that to be. So you could type in 3.5, hit OK, and it will scale your artwork. This also works with designs. The nice thing about it is you can do it for a little segment. So if I right click and drag over here and I want, this I want across the mountains to be 1.5 inches instead of 1.9. I can do that and it will scale the whole design to match that dimension. And again, that's using the ruler and a right click and drag. So I'm going to click on the ruler to deselect it, and then I'm going to scale this back up to what we had it when it was just fitting within that hoop. There we go. I'm going to hide that hoop so I have one less thing on screen. Okay, so then let me move this over so that we can have room to kind of plan this out a little bit more. So what I think now is we look at maybe background to foreground. I also like to kind of attach my stuff to the backing as much as possible. So I think doing the sky first works really, really well. And I think because it's such a large area that we make it a fill. Okay, next, once we get the sky kind of taken care of, then we have some decisions to make. Do you want to do the ocean next, or do you want to do the mountains next? And with material push, if we did the ocean, we'd have kind of this hole where the mountains are. If we did the mountains next, then we would just kind of have an edge, and I think we'd have less material distortion that way. So I would do the mountains next, and I would do the dark one and then the light one and then the medium one. And this too is where you start coming into some decisions based on size. Well, how big are these? Should I do them as satin? Should I do them as fill? I could get away with a satin, at least on the top two, but the bottom one would be a fill, and that to me, if these were satins and this was a fill, would tend to make these come forward in space and this fall back, and that just feels weird to me. I think keeping them all fills would be the best option. So I would do those all as fill. So then next, I think I would do the ocean. And this is where you can get a little bit creative. Yes, I could do this all as one fill and do all the detail in black, and that's totally fine. What you could also choose to do is, while embroidering all in the same color, you could alter the stitch direction every segment, and that will cause it to catch the light differently, and it will give the appearance of depth and the appearance of slightly different colors, even though you're using one color of thread. So yeah, let's go ahead and do the ocean next, and I would do that in fills, and I think I'm going to alternate those directions. And then I would move on to the trees, and here you can decide, do you want to do the tops first and then the trunks? You could avoid a trim if you travel down where the trunks would be and then underneath the detail of the ocean. But you could also do the trunks first and have the tops of the trees overlap the trunks a little bit. And that's going to cost you one trim, and I think it's worth it for me, so that's what I would do. I would do the trunks, and I think I can pull them off in kind of a rounded satin. And then I would do the tops of the trees in a fill. And then I would do the sun. And I think doing the sun, you can do the rays all in satins, and then travel through the middle, and then cover up all your travels with a fill for that circle. And then you can finish everything off, clean up all your edges with all of that black, overlapping all of it, clean it up with black satin stitches, and I think that would look quite lovely. That's really mostly what goes through my mind when I'm working through kind of the digitizing planning stages.